And now for a bit of Torah. This is the season of Teshuvah, a Hebrew word meaning repentance. These past 10 days were called the days of repentance, days dedicated to turning back from the ways we have missed the mark, though I think of it more like a time of repair. When things go wrong, when we behave in a way that causes suffering, an ethical imperative emerges calling us to repair. During this season, we are to remain open to critique and self-evaluation. We are to become aware of harm we have perpetuated, and we are to remain committed to repairing as best we can. Even if the damage began years ago or hurt large groups of people over generations, when we realize the harm we have caused, we must work to repair the damage. And the most courageous example of this that I have witnessed started with a professor of mine, who was one of the foremost Jewish theologians of the 20th century, Rabbi Dr. Eugene Borowitz. One could not overstate Dr. Borowitz's legend in the academic world, but in the early 1980s, he caused much harm to a segment of society. He stood up at a senior sermon review in front of a large gathering of the rabbinical school community and stated that he would not sign the certificate of ordination, known as a smicha, for anyone who identified as gay or lesbian. By the time he became my professor, he had already lived 24 years of this policy. And by this time he amended it, realizing it would just be easier if he didn't sign anyone's smicha. He was 82 years old when I took his core curriculum class, Jewish theology. And interestingly, for the final, after a serious semester of asking students to answer his very thought-provoking questions, he said that we would be able to ask the questions of him. A rabbinical class of 18 students, 30% of which happened to identify as queer, asked him about the ethical principles of his policy to not sign the smichas of queer students. After the question was floated, we all sat stone still, awaiting his response. Now, as I mentioned, Dr. Borowitz was an incredible scholar and a leader in the field, and he was quite mature. He had already taught 44 years worth of students. But in that classroom, on that day, in that moment, he paused to reflect. I will never forget the pensive look on his face, seriously searching for the words to get in touch with the root of his reasoning. The moment felt like an eternity waiting for his answer. And then he began with a touching tribute to his late wife, outlining how wonderful she was and how it was one of the greatest joys of his life to have children and how he firmly believed we should all have children, implying gay folks couldn't bear children. Naturally, some brave person in the class calmly pointed out that gay people were gay, not necessarily sterile. Not getting into the pros and cons of making sure that everyone had children. That's a whole other question. But just letting him know that gay people could have children too, that association was false. And with that, something seemed to shift within him. He kind of gave a, like, I hadn't thought of that possibility before. After class, I emailed him appreciation for the way he modeled serious reflection as such a learned scholar, to still consider the question of his students so thoughtfully. To which he replied, "Dear Heather, thanks for your lovely letter. I've never done anything like that with a class before, and I had no idea what to expect. I was and remain deeply moved by what transpired, and I think much of that exceptional result was due to the high human quality of your class. Many thanks to you for your part in that. May much good come your way, Jean Borowitz." Fast forward to May 2008. I was ordained, yay! And now I resolved to ask Dr. Borowitz, who is now 84 years old, to consider signing my smicha. I mean, all of my other professors throughout my rabbinical school journey had. His was the only one missing. The plan was that I would meet him in the library, smicha in one hand, pen in the other, and I would come out to him and then ask him to sign my certificate. What I remember of that encounter was a spirit of joy and hope for the Jewish future still filling the air following the college's recent ordination ceremonies. We sat down in big, comfy, 60s-style orange leather chairs that were older than I was, facing one another. And I began. I remember referencing our earlier conversation and appreciation of his tribute to family life, how I was glad he had had that in his life. I remember telling him I was in a loving relationship with a woman, that was Melissa, and then beginning a ramble, trying to project if we might marry and attempt to have kids, if we might try to adopt, or if we might try biologically, and sharing that I had an ovarian tumor at age 10 and not knowing if it would even be possible for me to bear children, and telling him I couldn't promise, but that his signature was important to me. And at some point he said, "Heather, give me the pen." Stunned into silence, I handed him the pen, and there it was, a form of repair, at least with one student. I understood the gravity of what had just transpired. Not only did I now have a complete set of signatures of my professors from rabbinical school on my smicha, but I knew it was a moment of teshuvah for him, a moment of repair. I had always been so confused as to how such a giant at our school would hold such a discriminatory policy. I had enjoyed his classes so much. Homework assignments in his class included writing in journals about our thoughts on God. And he really read them, offering lengthy commentary and provocative questions back to take our thinking further. He was preparing us for the tender and serious questions of the people we would one day serve. And he was doing this on an individual basis for the entire classes over generations of students. I also respected his work in the civil rights era. He was one of the 17 rabbis who had been arrested in St. Augustine, Florida, for participating in an act of civil disobedience, where whites and blacks jumped into a pool together to demonstrate desegregation. That night in 1964, as he sat in jail, he penned a letter called "Why We Went," which continues to inspire those who work for social justice, including me today. I couldn't reconcile the policy, which he had become infamous for, with my experience of him as a teacher and my knowledge of him as a theologian and civil rights advocate. So in that moment, his signing of my smicha felt like a realignment of who he was, someone who cared for humanity and his students and saw us deeply. In that moment, I felt like I witnessed that kind of realignment. I still look at his signature on my smicha and feel the weight of that moment. At some point after, I told my mentor, Rabbi Lisa Edwards, who's a lesbian and whose smicha he had not signed. She had been harmed by the policy. She reached out to him and he asked her to send hers to him to sign. I'm not sure how word got out, but on the college's celebration of his 90th birthday, in front of the whole rabbinical school in the sanctuary, on that day that everyone was celebrating him and his life achievements, he did a public act of teshuvah, repair. He signed the smichas of several people in their 50s and 60s who had been denied signatures decades earlier. A public repair. To this day, it still moves me inside to think of the damage that he caused and the pain that undoubtedly still lives in the people due to his homophobia, but also of the magnitude of the repair that took place within himself and the healing that transpired for so many. Can you imagine realizing you were wrong on a subject for decades and not digging your heels in, but rather having a tender enough heart to hear out those impacted by your actions or inactions, as the case may be? To do so as an octogenarian, to be moved by people who are a quarter of your age, That is remarkable. I'm telling you this history because sometimes, especially at this season, we revisit our own behavior. We consider what we have done, and sometimes it's easy to be callous with those who we might have wronged. Or we might think that since years of a certain way of doing things or a certain way of being, after all of that time, it's too late to do anything differently, too late to consider those around us in a new light, too late to make a change. Or that even if we make a change, our behavior won't mean anything. Well, it's not too late. It's always a good time to consider how our actions might have caused harm in the world. It's always a good idea to make repair where you can interpersonally and communally. It makes a difference to those you harmed, and it transforms the repairer as well. Thank God we have this day of reflection and repair today. Tradition tells us that the gates of repentance are always open. Let's not waste the opportunity.